This video will be explaining how to convert percentages into decimals. So, one of the quickest methods of doing this is going to be to take your percentage and think of it as a fraction, which is going to be 25 over 100. So to turn it into a decimal number, you need to divide the numerator by the denominator, which would be 25 divided by 100, which is 0.25. Now, another way of thinking about this is that you take your percentage and you imagine that the decimal point is here. And then because you're dividing it by 100, you are moving that decimal point 2 places over, meaning that it then sits here. And the reason why it's 0.25 and not 0.25 is that we need to add the 0 in as a placeholder. So it'll be 0.25, just to show you that in place value. Use a different colour actually. We have our tens, units, decimal point, and then after the decimal point is tenths and hundredths. So our 25% would sit here. When we're doing it place value, they're moving this way. So we move the 5 2 places, 1, 2, and move the 2 2 places, 1, 2. So the 5 ends up here and the 2 ends up here. And again, because this units column is empty, we have to add 0 as a placeholder. Okay, just to show a different example. %50. So if we want to figure out that as a decimal, we're still doing the same sum, we're still dividing it by 100, but rather than actually writing out that division, what we can do is we can take our percentage and imagine that the decimal point is here, and we're going to move it across 2 spaces, meaning it'll end up here and we put a 0 in front, so it's 0.50. If we then take 75% and we imagine our decimal point is here and we move it across 2, ends up here, we add our 0 in as a placeholder, 0.75. And for example, if we take 20% and we imagine our decimal point is here and we move it over 2, ends up here, which means it's 0.20. So by moving the decimal point this way 2 spaces, you are technically dividing it by 100. You're going to get the same answer. So what happens when our percentage, for example, is 1? So we still do the same method. So we take our percentage, actually, and we imagine the decimal point is here, and then we move it across 2 spaces. 1, 2. Now this time the decimal point is going to end up here. That gives us 2 gaps, which means we need to replace them with zeros. So 1% is actually 0.01. A bit like when we had, for example, 10%, and we took our 10, and our decimal point was here, and we moved it across 2, and then we had that gap there which turns into a 0. It's the same idea, but you've got 2 gaps this time, so you need 2 zeros. Let's do that again. So 5%, you have your 5, you have your imaginary decimal point, it moves over 2 places, 1, 2, ends up here. You need to replace this gap with a 0 and a 0 here. So it's 0.05. If you have 3%, it's going to be 0.03. If you have 4%, 0.04. 2%, 0.02. Now, you won't need this for level 1 maths, but it might be handy to learn. If you end up with a percentage that is already a decimal number, because it still has a percentage mark after it, it's still a percentage, it's not a decimal, it's a decimal percentage. So if we want to convert it just into a decimal number, then we still use the same method. So we take our number, but this time we already have a decimal point, which is here. So we move this decimal point that we already have to 1, 2. So it ends up over here. As you can see, we have a gap. So our new answer is 0.0331. Just to show you that again, if, for example, our decimal is 3% and we want it as a decimal, 2.3, we take our decimal point we already have, we move it to 1, 2, it ends up here. We add a 0, 0.123.